Welcome to the Moved to Meditate podcast. I'm your host, Addie D. Hilster. This is a place for vibrant discussions about mindfulness, movement practices, and ways to find more balance and presence in daily life. Here you'll find resources to help you progress on your path, as well as insightful conversations with mindful movement, yoga, meditation, and Dharma teachers from a range of traditions. On this podcast, we spotlight embodied approaches to mindfulness and the more contemplative aspects of movement practice. Listen in and connect to a community of like-minded practitioners. Hello, and welcome to episode 87 of the podcast. Today, we'll be hearing from two experts on neurodiversity-affirming mindfulness practices. We'll be talking about mindfulness meditation and how it can benefit some people with autism, ADHD, and other forms of neurodivergence if it's taught in an inclusive way. If you are a meditation teacher, I hope this episode will help raise your awareness and help you offer practices and create spaces that are more user-friendly for diverse minds. And for those listening who identify as neurodiverse, I hope you'll come away with some insights and resources to improve your meditation experience and really make it your own. Our guests today are Sue Hutton and Jan Wozniak, who work together at the Azrieli Adult Neurodevelopmental Centre at CAMH, which is the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto. The Azrieli Centre is a first-of-its-kind institute in Canada that does clinical, educational, and research work focused on neurodiverse populations. Sue Hutton has been a long-term practitioner and teacher of mindfulness meditation. She trained professionally with Jon Kabat-Zinn, who is the founder of mindfulness-based stress reduction, and she focuses her work these days on supporting mindfulness in neurodivergent communities, working with the research team at CAMH. Her perspective as a social worker and her experience in disability advocacy informs the way that she shares traditional mindfulness techniques. And Jan Wozniak is a licensed philosophical counselor whose interests in Eastern philosophy, Buddhism, and neurodevelopmental research led to his pursuit of psychology and mindfulness-based practices. As an autistic adult, Jan combines theory, practice, and lived experience to support fellow neurodivergent community members through participatory research, informed programming, and advocacy initiatives. Jan serves as a program engagement co-facilitator at CAMH and is planning to pursue graduate studies in clinical psychology in 2024. Sue and Jan were kind enough to join me for this conversation and answer my questions about neurodiversity and mindfulness practices. We covered a lot of ground, and if you hear some terms here that are new to you, be sure to check out the episode page on my website at movedtomeditate.yoga/podcast for some helpful definitions and resources. All of Sue and Jan's links will be there too. So you'll hear about addressing social anxiety and sensory issues that can come up for neurodiverse meditation students in a class setting, the importance of offering multiple ways to practice a technique like mindfulness of breathing or loving kindness meditation, stacking anchors to help students connect with the kinesthetic, visual, or auditory aspects of meditation on their own terms, being aware of how different verbal instructions may or may not work for everyone, and how they approach mindful movement or walking meditation for neurodiverse groups. Thanks in advance for listening, and I really hope you enjoy this conversation today. If you find this helpful, please share this episode and help Sue and Jan raise awareness about neurodiversity-affirming mindfulness practices. Here we go. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. Today, I am really excited to have two guests with me, Sue Hutton and Jan Wozniak, and we're going to be talking about meditation for neurodivergent minds. I already shared some of Sue and Jan's bios in the opening intro, so that means we can just go ahead and jump right into this conversation and get to know them and the important work that they're doing in the mindfulness field. So welcome, Sue and Jan.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
My pleasure. I do want to hear more about each of your backgrounds and what got you into this field of work, but maybe it's good to start with some really basic terms for those of us who are really just kind of learning about this topic and developing our vocabulary around these subjects. So let's start with the term neurodivergent. And we emailed a little bit about this, and I'm learning as we go. But when you say neurodivergent, what do you mean, and who's included under that umbrella?
Yeah, sure. So neurodiversity is a term that was coined by the autistic sociologist Judy Singer back in the 1990s. And the term it was sort of a reframing of how we would typically discuss, say, disability. I think a lot of people wanted to acknowledge that there were differences, and these neurological differences are sort of a regular part of human biodiversity or variation. So when we use something like neurodiversity or neurodivergent, it applies to, say, autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia. And I think that over time, this has sort of been expanding to include different neurotypes. And in doing so, we're kind of shifting away from, looking at things as a deficit or as something that's, something that's inherently, there's always sort of this, you know, trying to think of the proper word for it. Yeah, just sort of a deficit or dysfunction or something like that. It's more representative of the human diversity. So
And I love if I can jump in with Jan, and you'll notice, Addie, Jan and I have been working really closely together for the last, over the last year, doing mindfulness groups for neurodivergent populations. So the two of us riff a lot.
That's
We've worked
great.
together pretty closely. But of course, Jan mentions Judy Singert, who's so important for this, and Jan touched on all the things that I would have said too around the beauty of the way Judy Singer framed this. And that was way back in like 1998 when she did her honors thesis, right?
Mm.
And it was only her thesis paper where she was started to use the term neurodiversity and the whole idea of looking at the human mind. Like when you really think about it, when I go on meditation retreats or when I look at any large group of say 100 people sitting together, they're all very different minds, and they're all like, how could any two of us have the identical mind, right? So in the same way, and Jan talked about that in the same way Judy Singer did, biodiversity is important for life, and neurodiversity is the same. It's critical that we have all these different types of minds to do stuff. Can you imagine if we all only had one skill set? Because
No.
if we all have the exact same wiring and we're really good at the same thing, we wouldn't get anywhere as a world. So, and so Judy Singer kind of kicked it off, and then like Steve Silberman, your listeners might be interested in. There's a book. This is another guy who came out. He was a science writer for like Wired magazine and things like that, and he wrote the book Neurotribes because he happened to be doing an article and suddenly realized that he was surrounded by people talking about family members who just had an autism diagnosis. And he started hearing it more and more. He's like, what the heck's going on? What is this autism? So he started exploring that and researching it a little bit, and then put out this amazing book looking at this idea of tribes and how we are all different neurotypes, and it takes all of us to make the world go round. And then of course Temple Grandin, autistic author and speaker and researcher, who talks about the importance of embracing all of our amazing differences, and like Jan was saying, looking at it from a strength perspective, not a there's something wrong with you, but let's explore what your strengths are. You're amazing. You're really good at this particular thing, and let's embrace that.
I love that. And I think it's really helpful to help us move away from this kind of mindset where we're othering people who are wired differently than we are. And there's such a tendency towards that. And I'm curious in that kind of in that context, how you feel about the term like neurotypical and versus neurodiverse and sort of like creating two sets of people, the typical and the not typical. Like, how do you feel about that? Does that apply, or does it have some use and
How
some
much time do
danger?
we have? How much time do we really have? I mean, I think Jan and I could go on for hours about this, but I'll say a couple of things and I'll turn it over to you again, Jan. But um, it's interesting because there's neurotypical people who are almost like autism averse, right? Like who
Mm,
are othering, who pathologize. Uh, a lot of these neurotypical, like sort of rigid, people who like put people in boxes and they have to stay in those boxes. And we have to create a sustained environment where only neurotypical people can thrive. It's very ableist, right? So we have
very.
this, it's an interesting thing. Jan and I talk about accessibility all the time and making mindfulness accessible because often people think, that means creating wheelchair ramps. That's what accessibility means, making sure there's ramps. And you, of course, this podcast is all around movement, right? So it'll
Hmm.
be fun to talk about how Jan and I approach movement and mindfulness. But neurodiversity, we're really embracing kind of fighting against ableism and embracing a more inclusive environment that includes the way our brains work, not only the way our bodies work, but making
Hmm.
things accessible for different ways of thinking. Did I answer the question at all, or did I go totally off on some? I think I went
No,
off.
that it makes sense. It's a little bit of a complicated question, and I'd be curious what you think, Jan.
Yeah, I mean, I encounter it a lot too as someone who studies both psychology and disability studies. So you sometimes find the terminology where people use disabled, or some people use the term able-bodied, and I think when it comes down to having a way of sort of differentiating, I think a lot of people use neurotypical or they use neurodivergent, and it seems to be kind of well accepted. Like I've from a lot of the readings that I've done, it just seems like it's kind of stuck, and it seems like it's sort of the terminology that's being approved by the communities as well. And I think that's something that it might create maybe it creates a little bit of a divide, but it also is a way to kind of have these discussions and be like, well, and I think a lot more people now are comfortable saying, well, I'm neurodivergent, and again, this type of language isn't meant to otherize or to normalize certain types of neurotypes. So it's creating this maybe a more open discussion that isn't as problematic as we've seen throughout the history of some of these areas of research.
I love
Yeah,
that.
that's really helpful because I think, we don't want to erase the lived experience of people who have a perspective where, they do perceive life and everything differently. And so we want to be able to honor that, but without creating this hierarchy in the language. So I think that can be such a slippery thing. So thank you for that discussion. And I'd love to just dig in a little bit to each of your, personal histories and backgrounds and what it is that led you to looking at mindfulness through this lens. Who wants to start?
For me, I began my mindfulness journey. I was luckily pretty young. I was 16 when I first came across it, and I'm 57 now. And I jumped into it with both feet. So I came from a family in which, there was some interesting background. My mom had, had some suicide attempts when I was younger. So there was a few things that were going on that sort of created a slightly dysregulated household. So for me, it was finding home and stability. And I dove in. I was very, very lucky to come across Ram Dass, the kind of the pioneer. I always think of Ram Dass and Thich Nhat Hanh as being two of the people who brought mindfulness to the West. And so then, studied in very formalized way, lived in India for a year and studied with all kinds of great teachers in the Theravadan Buddhist tradition, as well as some
Mm.
in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. So very, very traditional. And some of those boot camp traditional ways of practicing, I noticed were harmful for some of the practitioners, like some meditators who arrived trying to do their first 10-day retreat when I was volunteering as a support person. And I remember having to go out of my way once at a 10-day silent meditation retreat where there was clearly someone with a trauma background, you know, probably could have applied any label, to this woman, trauma background for sure, but perhaps autism, perhaps ADHD, some other wiring that made it quite difficult to be a part of a 10-day retreat in such a rigid setting.
Especially as a beginner coming in, and that's your first dip into the practice. That's a very big dip.
Exactly, exactly. So I remember bending the rules a lot, and even getting in a little bit of trouble from the teachers there because I was bending the rules so much to make it accessible for this person. And
Hmm.
that experience really left me realizing these traditional forms of mindfulness can be very harmful because they don't provide flexibility. And I was very lucky. Then I did the training with John Kabat-Zinn, mindfulness-based stress reduction, and I was delivering the traditional 8-week MBSR courses for a number of years. And there's a rigidity, there's a real rigidity, and there's a real ableism in the
Hmm.
way those programs are taught. And sometimes people stick to the format without realizing that there needs to be flexibility to honor everyone's experience. And I've seen it create harm. And then, very very lucky for me, I ran into the amazing Dr. Yona Lunsky, who is an incredible psychologist, and she's the director of the place Jan and I met and we work, and that is the Center for Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto, and we're part of the Azrieli Centre, which is a center specializing in research for people with neurodevelopmental disabilities. So Yona and I met there because Yona wanted to start researching mindfulness
Hmm.
and brought me on. This is back in 2015, I guess, and we first started doing mindfulness for caregivers of autistic adults. And so we did a number of research groups, and we still are continuing that work. So lots of work on caregivers. But then she said, Sue, are you interested in working with me to develop an accessible curriculum for autistic adults and work with autistic advisors? So that's when my life turned upside down in the best way possible because I got to start working with all these autistic meditators. And we developed, and Jan being one of the incredible people who's come on board with us. Um, and it really requires looking at mindfulness from a very different perspective, which is incredible and flexible and so much deeper and so much more at the heart of what the mindfulness teachings are supposed to be all about.
Really like challenges you to see into the essence of what it is we're trying to practice. What are we
Mhm.
trying to do here? And how best to bring that about for
Yeah.
any individual person.
It's sort of a bringing together of, so I was doing all this mindfulness work. And again, during the John Kabat-Zinn, I was working in the cancer community and the education and the school system. And meanwhile, I was working over here in neurodevelopmental disabilities at the same time. I was doing both for, about 20, 30 years. And then finally they came together because, there just wasn't this space in mindfulness to create this flexibility in how we need to be teaching this. So we're really lucky that Dr. Yonalinsky's provided us with the ability and the freedom to adapt mindfulness and make it more accessible. So yeah, Jan probably has lots to say on this too.
Yeah, I guess my background. So I I grew up undiagnosed for a lot of my life. I grew up in a really small, rural. I don't know what you call it, like a hamlet, kind of in the middle of nowhere. So there wasn't a lot of resources. There wasn't a lot of knowledge. Like mental health literacy was basically non-existent. So it was. I found it was my life was very difficult at various periods, including adolescence, and then especially when I went off to university, there was no I was kind of felt lost. So for me, I was always a very inquisitive, philosophical person. I I started to kind of just do my own exploring. So I came across a lot of Taoist texts and Buddhist texts, and I studied a lot of Western philosophy at the time, which some writers were really interested in Eastern philosophy. especially and mindfulness was something that kept coming up. So as I read more, I kind of I just found myself very curious, and I felt like it was something I needed to deal with some of the restlessness and the anxiety that I was feeling, and the overwhelm, the sensory overwhelm that I was experiencing. So mindfulness became one of the tools that I used to help navigate these very neurotypical settings or these ableist environments that I found myself in commonly, to help sort of work through that, sort of the overwhelming and daunting experiences. So um, after that, I finished my first degree, and then I was still very curious about philosophy, so I went on to complete my an honors degree in English and philosophy. I went on to complete my master's in philosophy, but I felt myself really obligated or very compelled to want to apply some of the teachings. I wanted to not just write about the theories and write papers, but to actually apply this in ways that would benefit people. So from there, I actually went into psychology and started to look more into neurodevelopmental conditions, autism and ADHD especially, and learning, well, maybe this would be a way to implement some of these practices and what I've learned throughout my life. But then so like Sue, I got in contact with Yona Lunsky, and that's actually how I met Sue. And then we started to talk over the last couple of years, and we've been sort of collaborating on these different projects to make mindfulness more accessible for neurodivergent adults. And that's sort of my backstory. Yeah.
Wonderful. This topic of neurodiversity is not one that's really included very often in mindfulness teacher trainings, at least not yet. And that seems like, the more I learn and the more I think about this, that seems like a big blind spot, that's probably creating a lot of barriers for people who might enjoy and benefit from these kinds of meditative practices. And you kind of touched on this a little bit in your share, Sue, about there can be a rigidity in the way that mindfulness is taught, and there's kind of the balancing of wanting to honor tradition, and then in the kind of secular mindfulness world, it feels like there's a desire to kind of standardize and have different kinds of metrics for how we're teaching and different sort of rubrics for that. But we may be losing some of the flexibility to adapt practices, or to use our own instincts as teachers to adapt practices when we need to. And you wrote something, Sue, in this article I read on mindful.org that I thought was really just to the point, where you said, if you're not getting somewhere in a certain meditation practice, you're not doing it wrong. It may just be how you're wired. So all of this is just to ask, do you see a need to raise awareness about this topic, both for, teachers who are delivering these teachings, but for students who may be coming into these environments with a desire to learn mindfulness, but then struggling with how it's presented?
We're shouting it from the rooftops. Yeah, yes, yes, yes. So much so. It's incredible. Mindfulness is one of these things, and Jan, jump in, because Jan's been exploring other ways of teaching mindfulness through different university settings too. And I'm blown away at, we're all very excited that mindfulness is being embraced by the mainstream in the way it is. Like, in when I say we're excited by that, what I mean is, this is wonderful that it's being made available for more and more people, right? It's also being watered down. There's a lot of issues with how it's being taught,
Mm-hmm.
but I think that it's also kind of getting in the hands of a lot of people who are just eager to do something with it without the real understanding and the depth of the practice. So the more you have the depth of embodied practice, and then part of that, to me, also involves making it accessible for people. If we truly want all sentient beings to experience happiness and freedom and be free from suffering, then it's upon us as teachers to find out, how do we serve people? How do we learn about the needs of everyone that we can possibly provide these services to? And Jan and I can go on forever about how the neurodivergent community, there's there's a higher association with depression and anxiety. There's a high need for supports like this that need to be accessible. So yeah, we find it super important to get this out there. And there's, you might know a group called uh, Mindful Society, who they operate out of Toronto. Jan and I have been chatting about some work with them. So I did one 4 module series with them
Mm-hmm.
on neurodiversity in mindfulness, and we're just talking about doing some more work with them too to continue to get it out there.
Yeah, that would be fantastic. I'm actually working through that course on the Mindful Society Global Institute, your course. So,
Oh, no kidding. Okay.
yeah, it's great. There's a lot of resources there. So, and it's unique as far as I know. I've never seen another training for mindfulness teachers on this topic.
That's right. Right. I don't think so.
Oh, Jan, did you have anything to add to that, to this, the need to raise awareness?
Yeah, with mindfulness, I know firsthand, and even just with some of the communities that I've worked with, that there are obviously a lot of benefits. But in a lot of the discussions that I've had, and even with my own experience going through, I've done the 8-week MBSR, I've done MBCT, I've done various certificates at universities, and just trying to learn more, like what's sort of out there and how is it being taught. I've always been sort of curious about that. But in a lot of these discussions, I'm finding that I'm having, a lot of individuals are saying that it seems like a lot of the time it doesn't really resonate with them, or maybe it doesn't apply to their lives, or it's not really addressing very pertinent issues that they wish it would. And I think that having a shift, or maybe even just having more training available that would address some of these these concerns, or even just opening up more dialogues, would have a tremendous benefit, so we could actually modify things and then have even a more inclusive community, and in terms of the services that we're delivering.
Can you think of any particular examples of what might be going unaddressed?
Yeah, there's quite a few. I feel like a lot of the time, uh, a lot of individuals are discussing things like the anxiety of sometimes, if you're cultivating a certain mindfulness classroom or setting, for example, is it inclusive of a neurodivergent person? Is it does this person, a lot of people have social anxiety, a lot of people have sensory issues, so when you're going through some of the practices, first of all, going in a room with a bunch of strangers can be incredibly overwhelming, so you almost have to go and make it that much more welcoming, and that much more, um, you have to kind of disarm it in the classroom, or make it a lot less stressful, make it more inclusive, make it more welcoming. And then from there, I'd say things like, are we facilitating a dialogue? Are we listening and kind of interacting and learning from one another?
Mm.
Because I think sometimes it's very much there's an asymmetry there, where you have the teacher and then you sort of have the participants, but really having that group discussion to foster that community connectedness. In terms of delivery, I think that would be really helpful. What about you, Sue? Do you have any ideas?
Totally well said. I agree with everything that you just said. And another thing that Jan and I do, and just in terms of the climate of the groups, is it's really important to foster acceptance and to let everybody know that they're the expert of their own mind. Right? It's not, we're not the experts of what's going on in there. They know what's going to work best. So we really frame everything in that way. The other thing, just to answer your question, I mean, I've seen a lot of teachers uh, just deliver a mindfulness technique in one way. So now
Hmm.
we're going to practice this technique, and here's what I want you to do. And so they deliver the technique. That technique might be a trigger for someone. So knowing that we're all wired differently. So if we come in with the baseline knowledge, everyone's wired differently. Everyone is going to benefit from a different practice, and some people are going to be harmed by certain practices. So it's really important to set the practices up in a way that we are providing a few different options of which sense door you're going to engage with. So mindfulness, John Kabat-Zinn's famous book, Come to Your Senses, right?
Hmm.
When you think about it, for somebody who has sensory overload or some sort of sensory processing stuff going on, which we all do in different ways, right?
Hmm.
So to ask somebody, I mean, we've experienced, asking someone to, just concentrate on sensations in the body. Red flag goes off. It's like that puts me into a panic attack. Some people will say. So by asking me to just do a body scan, you're triggering a panic attack. So we don't want to do that. Asking some people to concentrate on the sensations of the breath. Same thing. Panic attack, very negative experience. So those people are going to say, screw this mindfulness stuff. I'm out of here. Either they're going to feel like they're a failure because they can't do it right because they're only being taught in one way.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I mean, I see that a lot. And also like visualizing. I see sometimes people just include visualizing, assuming everybody can visualize. So there's a lot of this ableist stuff that happens in practices where we're asking people to do things in that neurotypical way, and we're not providing the teachings in a way that are inclusive for everyone.
Yeah, there's so much in what you just said that I think overlaps with trauma sensitive mindfulness as well.
I always think
Giving,
that. Yeah.
yeah, lots of options or just enough options, not overwhelming us with options, but
Yeah.
some clarity that there's choice and you can choose how you practice and there's more than one way to practice. And
Yeah.
that attention to the environment as well, so important to create a sense of safety and welcome and as much ease as possible.
Yeah. Can I use an
And
example of ableism when this was something I did?
sure.
So, and then I mean, we have so many examples, but this was I remember feeling just so awful after this. But I remember doing a retreat, or sort of like a day retreat, a virtual thing that we were doing with caregivers during the pandemic. And there was I could see the screen. There's like all these faces on the screen, and we had been working together through the 6-week curriculum that we have. And so I led a walking meditation. This is to your movement point. So
Hmm.
I led a walking meditation. And, so we have a way that we've sort of developed doing this walking meditation in kind of a breaking it down by pieces, accessible way. And then we had a bit of a discussion about it afterwards. And one person who was there on the screen, just like right now, I know that listeners are only hearing our voices, but we're actually seeing each other. We see our faces from the shoulders up. And so one woman said, "Oh, I'd love to share. Doing that walking meditation reminded me of being a child when I was still able to walk." And she shared that she was in a wheelchair, but you couldn't see from her
Mm.
shoulders up. So I totally had no idea that this person was using a wheelchair and required adaptations for the practice to be taught in an accessible way. And she was so gracious, and she talked about, visualizing herself as a child walking. But that was just such a reminder to me, use universal language all the time. Right. And there was someone else who's blind who was in one of my groups. And I was I was about to do a movement meditation. I've shifted from the term walking and calling it movement and adapt it for all mobility devices to be able to move.
Hmm.
And I shared something about, if you're sighted or not. And then a woman shared, "Oh, I'm actually blind. Do I need to adapt this?" And I was so glad that she had shared that, right? But hence universal language. It's important to try and be inclusive with everything we do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to Jan's point about having discussion and getting feedback from students is so important because when we're teaching meditation, we can only see a very small sliver of what is going on for that person who's sitting there so still and quiet. Who knows what's going on inside? When I teach movement, I have a little more information. I can kind of see, you know, to what degree you're doing the movement, and I still may not know why, you're doing it that way. Did you feel pain? Did you have a strong emotion? Did you understand my instruction? Did you choose something else? It's still very complex, but there's a little more visual for me to pick up on, which is not true when I'm teaching meditation, so I feel like that conversation, that asking for feedback is so important, for the teacher to keep in connection with what's going on and for that learning to happen in the room, in both directions. So, yeah, thank you for naming that, Jan. And so another piece I want to kind of pull on from what you were saying, Sue, is the ability to visualize. I once had a student after a movement class email me and say, "Hey, just so you know, I have aphantasia." And when you give instructions that say, move your spine like a river, I have no idea what to do with that. That's meaningless for me. I can't picture that visual image. So, can you try to use more straightforward language in class? And I so appreciated that feedback. And it really made me realize like the kind of language we use doesn't always work. And it's important to kind of mix different sorts of types of cues when we're teaching movement or meditation. So I'd love if you would speak to that a bit, because we love our poetic language as mindfulness teachers and our invitational types of cues and instructions. But can you speak a bit about um, different kinds of language that may or may not be effective for neurodiverse practitioners?
Yeah, I think that it's important to acknowledge that, yeah, there's with language you have to consider things like, a lot of people have alexithymia, and that means it can be really difficult for them to sometimes connect with those inner states and their emotions and to express themselves. Other people have really, they struggle with interoception or interoceptive awareness, so they're a lot of the time they it if we're not providing diverse minds with diverse tools and resources, it's really hard to um, to have everyone feel included, and as though that the programs are actually speaking to them. So those are some of the boundaries that we like that I think Sue and I have both encountered too. Is finding, applying different types of communication. Some people are visual learners, so not just using language, but maybe offering, for example, if you're doing something virtually, offering an image or maybe showing a video or something that it really creates a very concrete example of what something might look like and how someone's describing it or experiencing it, instead of just relying primarily on, say, verbal instruction.
Yeah, it makes our work a little bit more complicated because we have to make sure, like, when we really want to be truly inclusive, we have to be willing to adapt our environment and to offer the teachings in ways. So, like Jan said, like some people are the opposite. You're asking about, Addie, like about the person with aphantasia who doesn't visualize. Um, and then there's people who have requested at the end of our groups, please send me like visual depictions of all of this because I need to see a picture in order to do this, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I do a really basic exercise of just having people experience feeling their hand. I get people to hold their hand up and just take note if you can feel sensations in your hand. And it kind of looks like people are making an oath. We do this toward the beginning of our program to sort of do a quick and dirty look at our own minds on how we experience. And people hold their hands up, and then they, explore whether or not they can feel any sensations in the fingers and the palm and the differences in the top of the fingers and the knuckles. And then we say, okay, you explored that. Now, if you're comfortable, close your eyes and just picture an apple and have people just sort of like picture an apple, whatever that means to you. Is it round? Does it have different colors? Is there different shading? How bright is it? Is there a stem on it? And then get them to do that and then say, okay, now we're going to just enter in the chat function, or we're just going to share how many of you were able to visualize an apple. And then how many of you were able to feel your hand? And it's different for everybody. And then we say, great, we're all different. So take that knowledge and that information into all of the meditation exercises we're about to do, knowing you might not visualize. You might not have this direct interoception ability that's really strong to feel the feels. So we're going to explore ways to do that. So with every meditation, we try offering it in ways that we have different anchor points, right? So for instance, if we're going to do some sort of like loving kindness meditation, so we might say something like, imagine a sun above you if you're visual, and feel the sensations of that shining down upon you if you're more physical. And if you are neither of those things, you can repeat some phrases of, I am experiencing love in my body, or whatever the phrase is. Some people might have more of a connection with words or numbers, right? So we
Mm.
try and offer the practices in all these different ways and then explore. And then, like Jan said, and then the real thing is to say, okay, what worked for you? Or did none of that work for you? And did you come up with your own tools and techniques? And here's where having some expertise and some experience with mindfulness comes in. Because then people might say, "Oh yeah, I thought about chocolate cake the whole time." Like, not that anyone's ever said that to us, but uh, those are my meditations. but we can help them hone in what their natural way of being present is, and helping them connect that to a direct sense practice. Sometimes we develop unique practices for people because their way of connecting to the present moment is through some sort of anchor that we don't use in our teachings. You got to be open, got to be open-minded.
That's wonderful. And I think that's so smart to ask people to just sort of do an inventory of these different ways of
Yep.
experiencing and to kind of share about it and normalize that. Because I think I really believe we all have a natural capacity to be present and experience mindfulness. And it's kind of like, how do we learn to recognize that? How do we learn to recognize how we do that? And that can be really empowering the way you're describing your teaching, to give people those experiences and then let them learn for themselves, like, oh, these are the kinds of practices and techniques that really work for me. I'm going to run with that, rather than getting lost in the ones that are just not, resonating right now, or just not a good fit.
You know what, Addie, on that note, there was a meditator, and I'll say it briefly. Once there was a meditator in one of our programs who said, can I meet with you privately? That's the other thing is, so when we offer these 6-week programs, we always provide the opportunity to meet privately also. And we'll do one-on-ones. Just in case they're not comfortable. Jan was talking about
Mm-hmm.
the social anxiety a lot of neurodivergent meditators might have. Do they want to just chat one-on-one? Somebody once met with me one-on-one, said, look, this is really nice. You guys are really nice, but it's not working for me. None of these techniques. You've showed us everything under the sun. None of it's working. So I said, okay, so let's talk about what do you do during the day? And then, so we kind of got down and talked a little bit about the way this person experienced their day. And you know what? Their Keurig machine, these coffee
The
machines,
coffee, yeah.
that was the meditation sweet spot, because that Keurig machine, and we designed a meditation together that we call the 3 S's: sight, sound, sensation. That particular coffee machine, there's a scent of the coffee that comes, right? So that there's that smell. So, like, let's just pause and really experience getting into the smell. What does it feel like when you breathe in? Where do you feel it in the nose? And then the sight. And there's apparently, I haven't really looked at a Keurig machine, but there's a little circle that moves around while the coffee is making. And that was an anchor point, just observing the vision. This was someone who's sighted. So just staying present with the vision. And then the sensation of, what do my feet feel like? What does my body feel like relaxing here while I'm looking at this moving thing? So the 3 S's. It's something we don't do with everybody, but that's what worked for that person.
That's incredibly creative. I love it. And such a good way to bring mindfulness into daily life, which is really the goal.
Exactly.
Yeah. Maybe we can go back a little to the conversation about meditation on the breath or on body sensations, because I think those are two of the big ways that we spend a lot of time meditating in your standard kind of mindfulness course. Meditation on the breath or the body scan. And you've mentioned sort of two different issues with this. For some, it's like very difficult to interocept and pick up on those signals in the body. For others, it can lead to more of a sensory overload. So maybe you can talk about, how you navigate that and offer some options with, do you teach breath practices and body scanning practices, and how?
We sure do. And I might even ask Jan to describe how we do we provide options. Jan, if you'll describe like the difference between the kinesthetic, the figure eight, the lotus. I'll say a quick thing first about the body practices. Um, and again, it's going back to that. This is back in the 1980s, and this meditator who was on a silent meditation retreat and having a trauma response to being there, and I was doing everything in my power I was just a volunteer, like I was serving, as we call it, on a retreat, assisting the teachers, and I was just making sure the meditators on retreat were okay. And this person was having such a trauma response. And you know what I did? I loaned this person my itchy wool sweater. And this was a meditation retreat where it was all about the body scan. It was Goenka format,
Mm-hmm.
which
Mm-hmm.
is, Goenka calls it the body sweeping, but lots and lots of time, 10 hours a day doing these body practices. I loaned them this really itchy sweater. And I said, just try and feel the itchiness on the body and stay on the surface. Don't go into the trauma feelings inside. Stay on the itchy, and they loved it. As bizarre as that sounds, staying so finding ways to focus on something, that exteroception, something that's outside. We also, like, we go in little tiny bits and pieces, like the good old classic Hans Selye. Hans Selye, one of the early stress reduction
Mm-hmm.
writers, and
Mm-hmm.
the progressive muscle relaxation techniques. So rather than diving right into a body scan, just tense and release your hands. Just tense and release the muscles in the face, and just go body part by body part. Real simple, just one little part at a time, and you don't have to dive right into the deep experience of being fully in the body. Then you slowly get to that.
It's titrating and slowly learning how to relate to and connect with sensations.
Yep.
And as with any mindfulness, noticing our reactivity and learning how to work with that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the breath, I quite like the way we've adapted. Jan, do you want to talk about a little bit of how we do the breath?
Yeah, like for some people, for example, like we with like the kinesthetic dimension, where just sitting there and focusing on the breath, that might be again overwhelming. It might be something that doesn't fully resonate. You have to think too with autism. You usually a lot of the time you're going to experience a co-occurring or co-occurrence of something like ADHD. So we've actually found that a lot of people like to incorporate movement or finding different modalities where we're kind of stacking them. So it's not just the breath, but if we do something like a lotus breath where we're sort of opening and closing the hand to synchronize with the breath, or doing something like drawing a figure eight, whether it's in front of you on your leg or something. And then we have another one called the Hoberman sphere, where it's sort of this. It creates sort of this, not just a kinesthetic but almost a visual component, because people are seeing the sphere. They can almost picture the example of the sphere opening and closing, and by incorporating these different elements, it makes it easier for people to maybe focus less on the breath itself, or some of the internal sensations they might be dealing with, that might be overwhelming, and then they're able to sort of incorporate this externalizing component that allows them to really ground and orient themselves with a particular type of breathwork practice. And Yeah, I think that I've witnessed it too. Like one might not resonate for someone, or all three might. But by providing the options and then having that moment to have the discussion, I find that that's really a really effective way to incorporate breath work and mindful practices.
And then providing the celebration of neurodiversity in the way we teach it. In that, so we'll provide, okay, so here's 3 different ways. See if any of these ways of connecting with the breath work for you. One's kinesthetic, one's visual, maybe one's more sensory, feeling the body. And then we'll have a discussion. What worked for you? And then sometimes people come up with even different things. Jan, you might remember there was one participant who took the figure eight breath, combined it with a sensory, and did it on their hand. So they just drew a figure eight breath on the palm of their hand. And they loved that because it was also the symbol of autism. You often see this sort of infinity symbol for autism. And so they were feeling this autism pride while they were experiencing this sensory experience and unifying that with the breath. So creative, doing whatever helps you feel you know.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Yeah, that makes so much sense. This idea of kind of stacking different, I don't know, how did you describe it? This different sense doors or sensory experiences along with the breath, um, in a way that makes the breath more tangible, or maybe that's not the right word, but just more
Mhm.
accessible as a
Mhm.
object of mindfulness. It makes so much sense to me intuitively, and it's interesting to me as a movement teacher who's my work has been a lot about integrating, mindfulness skills into movement practices and decompartmentalizing between those two spheres of practice. And so I do teach things like that lotus hand meditation, but I never thought about it in this context and why it might be helpful. So this kind of opens up another sphere for me of, who that might work for. So I really appreciate that. And this is, really interesting to hear. For some, it might be hearing the sound of the breath. For some, it might be a visual of movement connected with the breath. For some, it might be a physical movement with the breath, or a touch sensation, or, something else. But I love that. One more thing I wanted to ask about, Sue. I saw in an article you wrote about meditation bells, and that these can be problematic for some practitioners. And it wouldn't have occurred to me, because I am one who really enjoys that, tradition of ringing the bell. I have one sitting right here. You can't see it over my shoulder, but could you talk a little bit about that? Why using a meditation bell may or may not be beneficial?
And I think we're kindred spirits in certain ways, because I'm a lover of the bells, and I love Thich Nhat Hanh's teaching that the ringer of the bell rings this this loving kindness, and then it ripples out, and all those who hear it receive it. Like, there's all this beautiful teaching with the bell, and I love the formalized beginning and ending of the practice with the bell. So trust me, I'm a huge fan of the traditions, right? The triple gem and the three bells. I love it all. And again, here's why I love the autism community and meditating with the autism community, because they really taught me. I remember going in with a bell and saying, "Okay, we're going to try this," and half the people in the room jumped, like jumped out, like, whoa, that, and said that hurts.
Hmm.
Like, it hurts. It just triggers a jump scare. It triggers a jump scare response for a lot of people. And so even if you warn people there's going to be a bell ringing, it can still do that. And to be honest with you, when I listen to some guided meditations online, sometimes, like, I'll be like, oh, I'm in a wonderful state at the end of that, and then they ring the bell and it just, oh, someone's right out of it. So I relate to that too, that it can be a sensory overload. It's an easy sensory overload. I mean, I say that I used to teach in the schools, and we would ring the bell, and we would have, and you're probably familiar with this, and many of your listeners might be, but it's a great exercise to listen to. How long can you hear the ringing of the bell? Can you hear it all the way into the end? And then we'd have the kids raise their hand at the end of the bell. But, so they were sort of, okay, who's going to be able to hear it the longest? But you got to be really careful with that stuff, because it is harmful for some people. It can be painful.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's not one I would have necessarily thought about. So I appreciated that you mentioned it in that article, because that's easy to not use a bell. That's a very easy modification to make, just in case it's helpful for someone to not have that additional sound coming into the environment.
And I love that you mentioned that you do love the bell, as I do, because is another teaching for teachers, that sometimes we have to take what we love in tradition for us, and even though we want to honor tradition, sometimes we have to take that and say, okay, this is not really that appropriate here. And then I also wonder a tiny bit about cultural appropriation with the bell. Like, that's another
Hmm.
thing I sort of consider. Yeah,
Yeah, that's true. That's something to think about as well.
yeah.
Well, I think we're kind of running on time here, but I do want to touch just a little more on movement practice and ask about that, because it's such a big part of what I do in my teaching, and I think a lot of people who listen to the podcast. And just to ask, I know that movement practice, some mindful yoga is included in MBSR, and to ask if this is something that you like to use in your work, and if that's useful with certain neurodivergent groups.
I think we'll both have something to say on that. Do you want me to try and go quick, Jan, and then pass the baton to you?
Sure, that sounds good.
I was going to say, so when I went down to the States and did the week with John Kabat-Zinn in training in how to deliver mindfulness-based stress reduction, I spoke with him because at the time I was working with Dr. Lucinda Sykes, was the first person to teach mindfulness here in Toronto. She's a little bit of an icon, and a lot of the people who were coming to her programs, and I was working along with her, co-facilitated, there was people who had some pretty serious health issues and mobility issues. And I said to John Kabat-Zinn, I'm not that comfortable getting someone down on the ground, and I don't know if I can get them back up off the ground at the end of these yoga poses. And he said, don't worry about doing the yoga. It doesn't matter what movement you do, as long as you are teaching Addie all the stuff you just finished talking about, being present through movement. And so then we've adapted. I mean, there's so many ways of teaching movement. We started off with cat cow, like doing a basic yoga thing. We found it was difficult to do that virtually, and we had some people saying that they were hurting their backs with it. It was a challenge. We shifted over to a walking movement meditation. Um, there's one that I'm starting to incorporate a little bit, like a resist and yield, which is extraordinarily subtle, of just pushing down. Like even right now, you can just push down on your feet, like push your feet down into the ground as hard as you can. And you might notice that your thighs and your core are suddenly engaged. And then when you release and yield, then you can feel that letting go. So just this practice of very subtle movement of pushing down into the ground with the soles of the feet and then releasing. So subtle movement, but becoming aware of the subtle movement. Um, and Jan, you might want to say a couple words because we haven't touched on it yet. The importance of bringing mindfulness off the cushion, which is something Jan and I hold near and dear to our hearts in the movement. I don't know, Jan, what you have such great stuff to share on the movement stuff too.
Um, yeah, the movement. Obviously, like in the program, a lot of the time we'll incorporate mindful, like the mindful movement. For some, that involves mindful walking. But as Sue was mentioning, the bringing the mindfulness off the cushion. We really want to cultivate joy. We want to focus on the things that people are enjoying. We don't want to just focus on this is an area I want to work on. We want to kind of have that positive reinforcement to really ground and solidify the practices. So we often encourage people to find those joyous activities in daily life. And for a lot of people, maybe that's spending time in nature, or spending time with loved ones, going for a walk, or getting outdoors. For some people, it might be spending time with their pets, doing things like that in terms of. And again, it kind of goes back to that stacking. Sometimes it involves sort of the stacking of those different types of anchors when it comes to the mindfulness. We also found some interesting points from, again, it's great to have these conversations and really open up the floor, because we learn a lot in the process. So for a lot of people, they might adapt temperature. So depending on what time of the year, it could be really warm outside, which is nice, or when it's cool. I sometimes like to meditate in a sauna or sauna blanket, and I find that's really relaxing. For other people, it's being in or around water. So some people were actually practicing things in the shower. They'd sit and then just sort of go through some of those practices. So movement is such an interesting movement and activity. It can be such a powerful tool for teaching mindfulness. And I think for a lot of people who might feel a little restless, it could even be putting in some earbuds and listening to something, but also really focusing on, say, the movement, or the touch of the ground, or the feeling of the ground, or the breeze. Like there's so many different opportunities there for people who are maybe finding one practice incomplete or challenging. So we're always trying to incorporate ways of of making it more inclusive and making it more versatile in a sense for people. So yeah, and that's sort of how I see it. And there's a lot of people who might be sensory seeking, so being able to do the movements are sort of an invigorating thing, an uplifting experience. And other times where people want to unwind and maybe be more sensory avoidant or sensory, they want to kind of reduce that. Then you can do maybe something more gentle or something more lighter or something like that. That would be a good way to unwind. For example, some people wanted to run. Some people rode their bikes. Like there's all kinds of ways that we were incorporating movement into the program.
I think that's great. And I have definitely seen over my years in this field that movement can be a doorway into mindfulness practice for a lot of people who cannot really just come straight in and sit still without doing something for their body to regulate the nervous system or release some tension or just kind of wake up some sensations in some cases. So that's really, really interesting to hear about. But accessibility is such a huge piece. A lot of us in the yoga field have spent, the last few years really looking at accessible yoga. There's a whole accessible yoga movement and how we can take the ableism out of those practices and be more adaptive and inclusive of all kinds of different bodies in the movement practices. So that's a huge field of study as well. And it's just really beautiful to look at how that can come together with the meditative practices as well. So yeah, thank you for that. Well, thank you both so much for taking the time today to have this conversation. And if you have anything left to add, I'd love to hear that. And also where people can go to learn more about your work or different offerings that you may have out there for more education on these topics.
It'd be amazing to keep in touch. Jan and I are, I keep thinking, oh, I want to mention about our occupational therapist that we're working with, Kirsten Smith, who's a postdoctoral fellow who's doing some research at the CAMH Azrieli Centre right now. So we've been working with Kirsten Smith a little bit. So it would be wonderful to share a few of these things with you if there's a space to link them.
Yes.
Yeah, so we'll definitely link some of the work that we're doing. I also have a little website, Sue Hutton Mindfulness, where I try and link to things that we're doing with the Azrieli Centre at CAMH. We always have stuff coming up. Jan and I, well, we have not yet published. Jan and I just delivered these Public Health of Canada groups with the CAMH Azrieli Centre under Dr. Yona Lunsky's. She was directing this study, so that will be published. I don't know when this podcast comes out, but we'll make sure that you have the link to the paper that's going to be published.
Perfect.
And more information about it. And just great to keep in contact with you and keep talking about this stuff.
Yeah, thank you. Jan, do you have any resources or a website or anything you'd like us to make sure we share?
I'm pretty low tech. I don't have a website or anything like that. So most of the resources that Sue has shared will probably be the extent of what I can recommend for now. But I think that a lot of the stuff that we're doing will be becoming more available in the upcoming months. So yeah, if we can keep in touch, that would be great.
Fantastic.
Can I tell you how modest Jan is? I will send you a link, Jan, with your permission, to the meta-analysis. Jan published a paper on ADHD and mindfulness with Stanford University before I met him. And Jan, you never mentioned that, but it's a very impressive paper that Jan did. So we have some of Jan's papers that we can link to also, if you're okay with that, Jan. You're so modest about it.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's okay with me. Yeah.
Anything you all want to send my way, I'll be sure to link it on the episode page on my website so people can find all these resources and connect with you and keep learning.
That's great.
Thanks again so much for this conversation. I know that it's contributed a lot to my learning process, and hopefully our listeners have gained some insights from this as well.
It was a pleasure.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you for having us. It was a very great conversation, and it sounds like you have a lot of great ideas, and I'm glad to have had this discussion and get to share some of this content.
Yeah, thank you so much. So that's today's episode. If you enjoyed this conversation, please share it with a friend, subscribe on YouTube, or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and help others find it that way. To learn more about my work, the Moved to Meditate class library, courses, or teacher trainings, go to movedtomeditate.yoga. This is Addie D. Hilster. Thanks so much for listening.